becoming a counselor. You can go to the next slide. So at the Counseling Center, our mission is to support student success by providing information and services related to emotional wellness. And what that means for us is that we provide drop-in services, crisis services, we provide individual counseling for students, but then we also try to support staff and faculty by doing trainings on different mental health subjects. So depending on your role, if you're a student worker, you might find that that is something that you want to suggest to someone who you're working with at the college. You can go to the next one. So welcome to NoCap. If you click through, we'll get to the next things as we go. So I wanted to set up some group rules and norms just so that people feel like they can share. So the first thing is confidentiality. I wanted to say the whole reason why we were having this conversation about editing out student comments is that it's really important that people feel like what happens here stays here and they can talk and it won't haunt them later. They won't get talked about later. So the group norm is just that people don't share what happens inside the group. And then the next thing is respect, which seems obvious, to be kind and appreciate that people have different life experiences. And in Zoom and in person, that respect is both verbal and nonverbal. So not just not saying unkind things, but also not showing that in your face would be ideal. And participation. So no one has to talk. It would be great if people did talk. I feel like the more people put into the group, the more the better it will be. So no pressure, and also welcome. So the best way to talk is to use the chat anytime to type things you have to share. You can raise your hand if I'm talking, or you can unmute if I ask a question directly to the group. Are there any questions about that? Nope. Okay, you can go, Skylar. So the goals is what we're covering today, should we not run out of time, is sort of to understand how the body responds to stress and in all of its places in the scale of stress. And to be able to describe how you experience different kinds of stress, because it's very different for everyone. And hopefully by the end, we'll go over several different ways of responding to distress, but hopefully you'll be able to identify at least 2 ways of responding to distress that are helpful for you or that you anticipate actually using in your real life. Go ahead, Skylar. So this is a wild chart. The first thing I want to say is that this is a chart of trauma response, but the word trauma response is really just the most severe kind of stress response that a human has. But what the chart is describing is the overall way in which any body, like physical body, experiences stress, experiences that kind of overwhelm. So it doesn't necessarily always rise to the level of trauma, but it's helpful to know kind of what that arc looks like, because we all are kind of passing through this at any point in the day, really. So before I continue and describe this to you, I want to just take a minute and let people look at it and see if you can start to see where you land on this. I think I'm curious, if you can think of times recently when you've had any of these feelings or symptoms. So feelings on the left side of that arc. And then symptoms, so the actual physical responses that could be happening in your body on the right side of this chart. I think I'm also curious if anyone notices that they sometimes feel something as an emotion before they notice that it's taking place in their body, or they feel bodily escalation before they really identify an emotion that's related to it. So an example for me is that I often feel just fine and I leave work and I feel fine, and then I get in my car and I'm driving and I'm suddenly out of my mind impatient. I cannot believe what people are doing in traffic. Instead of slowing down for the person who's making a turn in front of me, I irrationally dart around them, And for me, then I'm oh my gosh, my heart rate is up. I do have adrenaline. I have no idea why, but I can identify that that's where I am in the sympathetic response. Even if it's not rational, it is something that my body is doing kind of independent of my own rationality, So one of the things I think this chart helps us to see is that our bodies are kind of in some ways operating independently. That word in the upper left, the nervous system with a neuroception of threat, that neuroception is your brain's pre-conscious ongoing assessment of whether or not threat is present, right? So like you're not really participating in that. So you don't always know why you are having a response. So even though it doesn't make sense, it's important to recognize that it's still taking place. So instead of suppressing it, we want to work with it. And that's really what this is about, to understand that our bodies are actually moving throughout all of these at any given point in the day. And if we can kind of offer it kindness and know how to respond in a way that actually works with our bodily symptoms or systems, then we will be able to regulate ourselves faster, maybe easier over time. It can be hard to learn. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about this is that the vagus nerve is a huge nerve. It runs all the way from kind of like the bottom of your brainstem down through the sides of your throat, down like through your stomach and all the way down into your bowel-y area. And that's why you see all of these physical responses on the right side. So many of them have to do with digestion, you know, and that's also why like people have weird bowel stuff happen when they're afraid, you know, it's because that vagus nerve is attached to all of that digestive system. So that's in the dorsal area is that lower area of the vagus nerve. The ventral vagal area, vagal area of social engagement is the one that's sourced mostly here in the throat and in the upper chest. So you'll notice later when we do some skills for chilling out, a lot of creating regulation has to do with engaging this ventral vagal area of the body. Does anyone have any questions about what they're looking at or just observations that they have about themselves or this chart?
I can go first. So something that I've reflected on, I know that when I'm going through a trigger response, usually I get very, very tired and very shaky and shallow of breath. So that's usually my notice of like, hey, something is going on around you. But I probably go through all of these probably about 10 times a day. So
yeah, cool, thank you. What that's I think actually a really common threat response. Like I think about for people who are feeling anxious about graduation, even that like the way that people can feel faint when they're afraid, like going up to give a presentation and you suddenly just think you're going to pass out, or people who see blood and pass out, this is their vagus system being like, oh no, we don't have to experience this and we'll help you tap out of this situation. You know, that's basically what is happening in that shutdown phase, even though it's just blood, like even though it's just standing in front of people, like it doesn't matter because our brain is like, this is bad. This is really, really bad. Has anyone else noticed anything or see themselves somewhere in this that's interesting? Okay, well, we are going to move on to the next slide. And the next slide is going to be, we actually might toggle between these slides, Skylar, so bear with me. So this is going to be a lot of actions, this part of the slide. So that whole arc is the arc of us becoming activated, of our internal protective nervous system trying to protect itself, right? And doing all these things that throw us out of balance in the process. You know, we're like, no, body, please stop, thank you. So what we want to try to do is deactivate our bodies by responding with kindness to the way that our body is trying to protect us, however irrationally. And that activation, as we feel it, can be that agitation, that tension or jitteriness, that we feel mobilized and often like we need to move around. And that's in part because we actually do have like physical energy that we need to discharge. If you ever see dogs that are fearful shaking, it's like them discharging that reaction, you know, like the onset of activation. An example of that would be like, if you see something that gives you like the hibbly jibblies and your skin just crawls and you get, you know, goosebumps up your back, like that is your body becoming activated. But like, this is so gross, I'm going to have to do something about it. You know, like it's a real there's kind of like an urgency to action about it. So other natural responses that people have are pacing. Humans also shiver, but I think more likely is shaking when we're nervous, when we're in the activated state. So just knowing that that's part of that parasympathetic reaction of becoming more escalated. So in that vein, the hug exercise is really very simple. You take your right hand, and you can do it with me if you want or not. Take your right hand and you're going to place it on your ribs underneath your left armpit, kind of right where you can feel your heart. And then you're going to take your left hand and reach it across and kind of grab your upper right shoulder. So this is a couple of things. This is feeling your heartbeat and just sort of being present with it, noticing what it is doing. In some ways, you're also creating a container. It's like telling yourself that it's okay. If you give yourself a little squeeze, it is like you swaddling yourself as a baby. It is you letting yourself know that it's all right to feel the way that you feel, that the urgency you feel to need to change this emotion doesn't help that go away, right? So it just helps you kind of sit with it a little bit. An extension of this exercise is a version of humming that sounds very silly. It's sometimes called the vroom breath. Has anyone ever heard of this? All right, so it is you're going to take a big inhale, and I'll demo it first, a big inhale. And then as you exhale, you're going to vocalize in the lowest register you can muster to kind of create a vibration in your chest that you should be able to feel throughout your arms. So it's something like this. And then you let your lungs kind of naturally fill with air again, and do it again. And let your lungs naturally fill. So this sounds silly AF, I know. But part of what it is doing, this vibration, is activating this ventral vagal part of your body. That part of you that is the more regulated part. You're creating a vibration there to try to get that part of your vagal nervous system back on board. You're like, this is the part of me that should be more activated, not the part of me that is freaking out. So a less silly way to do this would be humming or singing, and maybe singing in a lower register. If you're into death metal, maybe it's like throat singing. I don't know. I feel like I'm open to all things. But so the hug exercise is a thing that I do kind of by default when I notice that I'm just feeling tense, like I'm becoming that like activatedness. I wonder if anyone felt a little bit different after doing it. And I don't know if y'all tried the vroom breath. It is very silly. But if you did, how it felt doing it. And it's okay if nothing.
Felt pretty good. It made me think of when monks meditate, they usually use that hum.
Yeah.
So it reminded me of that.
Yeah, it's very like oming in that way. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So the next one to go to is attentional awareness. And this is really specific to anxiety. So anxiousness is not just regular tension or regular fear. It's anticipatory, like there is something unknown in the future that we can't predict or control, and that is the thing that we are tense and fearful of. It's very specific to that. And what's important about things that are happening in the future is that they're not actually happening. So if we are becoming escalated about something that is taking place in the future, then there's actually no threat around us. We're just feeling threatened generally, So one of the ways that we can diffuse that a little bit is by actually coming back to the permanent resource that is the present moment. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to just create what I think of as attentional awareness. But it's to choose something and to really appreciate it, to focus on it, and to experience it in the fullness of itself. So like an example would be listening to music, but you're not just listening to music. You're feeling it in your body, you're feeling it in the floor, in your feet, or in your chair. You're like maybe watching the mirrors on your car bounce, like you are in the music. Maybe you're listening for something new in it that you've never heard before, but you are giving it your full concentration to be with it as it is taking place right now. I have a few other examples, but I'm curious if other people can think of things in their life. You might notice that you do it naturally sometimes if you space out and you realize that you've just been staring at something and just looking at it perpetually for a while.
Mine's usually the clouds.
What do you notice about them when you're looking at them?
I usually try to look at the movement, if it's going quick, or if I can figure out how the wind is blowing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You get really curious about it. Yeah, Wes, go ahead.
Mine is usually just the wall, and I just start looking at all the textures and all the little shadows on the wall. I don't know why.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one. I think because the wall is like it's a really underappreciated thing, like for how much it has going on. I think as many senses as you can engage, the better. So I'm thinking about like, there are a couple of things. One is like novelty is like the trying to notice new things about it, which is actually what's really cool about the wall example and the cloud example. I think too, using the clouds to perceive wind, you know, like then you have the wind is like a second sensory part of your experiencing the clouds. I think one of my go-tos is a hot mug of tea. I'm sort of ambivalent about tea. Like, I don't know if I really like it, but what I do like is holding an extremely hot beverage that is almost too hot and thinking about how deep into my hands the heat is going and watching the steam move and like seeing the light on the mug, seeing if the steam changes over time, but to just really engage with it. And when I start to like drift off in my stress thoughts, to come back to this like one thing that I'm looking at. And just that much relief from the thing that is triggering you can be enough to help you to downregulate again. So that's one that I recommend. Also watching animals, if anyone has pets or children, watching other living creatures just like live in the full purity of themselves is like another way of engaging that like novelty, that delight, the present moment, like developing appreciation is actually like more recent research has come out that like appreciation or novel experiences, things that kind of create surprise for us like that, like seeing something new and something ordinary is actually really great for reducing anxiety and depression symptoms in people. Very interesting research there. So the next thing to move to is movement. And the reason why movement is important is because I was talking earlier about how when we become activated, you know, like the hibbly jiblies, your body is like getting ready, you know, like we're gonna go to war, that movement needs to get discharged somewhere, that energy has to go somewhere. And there are lots of different ways to do this. You know, like I said earlier, natural ways are pacing. Shaking is a way that our bodies try to reduce that tension that's inside of us, it tries to express it somehow. Yeah, so pacing is walking, basically, like going on a walk. So I can imagine combining that with looking at clouds, you know, for instance. For people who have issues with movement or pain, there's also really good research that imagining moving and breathing while you are imagining walking, for instance, can have a very similar relieving effect. Like things that are really helpful to think about in terms of movement are things that are repetitive or monotonous. So kneading bread dough would be one of those things. Let's see. If anyone ever lifts weights, that's actually a really unique and helpful thing. You're nodding, Wes, you're like, yes. One of the things that happens when you do a really hard motion is you breathe, you take a deep breath, you clench, right? There's like this really intentional kind of consolidation of energy, and then you lift, and that is like the release of the energy. You are pushing it into something, like releasing it into something else, and then you put the weight down. like the relief of physically putting the weight down is really analogous to the actual putting of weight down in your sympathetic nervous system. So I'd actually argue that like, I can't think of other examples in this moment that are similar, where you kind of consolidate the tension and then like rapidly discharge it into something else. I'm thinking like people who punch pillows, maybe that counts in a similar way. I don't know if anyone has other examples.
Whenever I have a lot of energy, I find that I just start moving around, just like jumping. I don't know, almost like in like the boxing sort of stance. I don't know why, but I just have all the energy I got to burn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, until it's intuitive, right? Also, I rock climb, and when I get scared, I come down to the ground and I go like, whoa, and it's just, I began doing it when I was like, I don't know, 30. And it was so silly. It just made me laugh. I couldn't do it and not laugh. And now I understand that actually doing that like silly shaking motion is me discharging all of the energy of being really stressed out, you know, of having been afraid. Dance is probably also something that people benefit from, any of those kinds of movement activities. So the next one, if we can move on, is softening. And part of this is that when we get really activated, we begin to hold tension everywhere. We hold tension, you know, in our chest, in our throat, often in our legs or our hips, you know, like, because even if we're sitting down, like being mad on Twitter, we are also like getting ready to fight, you know. So we start to hold tension in the places where our body knows it might need to activate in order to protect us. And that is also in our senses. So we physically, I think one of the things that you would have seen on that chart is that like our skin gets more tight when we're really activated. We also tend to look with more intense focus, like so our eyes are really tense. So softening can be lots of things. So it can be softening your gaze. So you're not just like honed in on something with your pupils dilated and you're ready to destroy, you know, but to kind of like open the aperture of your perception and to kind of like soften into the everything that is around you. Softening the tongue is maybe one of the most helpful things you can do. And again, it's because when you're holding tension in your throat there, you're keeping the ventral vagal system from engaging, right? So I want you guys to take a moment and close your mouths and feel your tongue kind of drop down to the floor of your mouth. And just try to feel it relax. It might kind of like float around your teeth in a way that's weird because you don't normally do that. And just breathe in that spot. And while you're also breathing there, I want you to take a hand and put it on top of your belly. And just see if, as you keep breathing, you can start to feel softness being created in your belly. Softness for more oxygen, a more full breath, a calmer breath. So not the tense up here breath, but the like sleeping baby, really low breath. When I'm tense in meetings, I put my hand on my belly, and someone asked me once if I was feeling well. And I said, I don't feel great, but I'm not sick to my stomach. I wonder if anyone notices anything in their bodies change. It can be really subtle, but I'm curious.
Just made me tired.
You sound very downregulated. Well, then the last skill that we'll go through is 3-5 breathing. Have you all tried any kind of breathing exercises before? Familiar with things a little bit? Okay.
Yeah, the biggest one I've done is box breathing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So box breathing is a more activated breathing. You get a lot more oxygen in it. which can be really helpful. Like I actually box breathe when I'm driving because I think I'm going to fall asleep. That's like a stay alert tactic. I should probably just stop driving, I'll admit. But so when we're really activated, one of those things on the list of physiologic responses is that like we get bronchial dilation, we start to hyperventilate a little bit. And part of that is that we're like gearing up for the fight. And that hyperventilation actually perpetuates that sympathetic nervous system response. So instead we want to hypoventilate. We actually want to exhale more. We want to create more carbon dioxide in our lungs. And that if you thought you were tired before, this is definitely the way to get there. There are a couple of different breathing exercises, but I feel like this one is the easiest for people who are not accustomed to doing counted breath. If when we are doing this, you start to feel like the counting is stressing you out, or like it's not in line with where your body wants to take a breath, and it starts to create a sense of urgency, just take the breath. Don't just do what you need to do. If it starts to create any tension in you, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, and something should be adjusted. So this is going to be a breath of counting 3 in and then 5 out. And I'm going to motion this with my hand while I do it with you. So I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, and then open my hand all the way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in. Does that make sense? All right, so get comfortable if you aren't already. And with me, we're going to take our first breath in. So next in. Just let that settle in you. You breathe normally. Does anyone notice anything?
I'm asleep now.
Were you seconding that, Wes?
I also feel tired now.
I haven't done this over Zoom, and so I found myself impulsively trying to exhale in an audible way, so you would know where I was in the breath, and the effect of it was actually very different because that's an energetic. It's called an Ujjayi breath in yoga, but it's a way of generating energy in yourself. It's called fire breath, and so I actually got really hot in my cheeks doing it because I was like. So don't do that. Don't try to exhale audibly, I've learned. The 3-5 breathing is a great starting point. I think a thing that I recommend is trying to increase the out breath if you can. And for me, the easiest place to do that is actually when I exhale. I might exhale for 5, but then I hold my empty lungs for 2 seconds, 2 counts before I inhale again. And sometimes that bottom of the breath is like my personal resting place for becoming more peaceful. It's like the moment of absolute stasis for me. Does anyone want to try that, where we would kind of stay for 2 counts at the bottom of the breath before inhaling again? Sure, okay. So I'm going to do the with the hand thing, but then when we get to the bottom, I'm going to just hold my fist for 2, and then I'll initiate again, okay? So we're going to go in 3. And just breathe normally. Did that one feel different to anyone?
Even more relaxing. I don't know how you did it.
if you are ever at the doctor's office and they're taking your blood pressure, holding your exhale count will decrease your blood pressure and your resting heart rate almost instantly. Like you can really mess with your medical numbers just by breathing differently in that moment. Which is saying something. I mean, it's biofeedback. Those are the skills that I have to present. Skylar, if you move to the next slide. So this is the contact information for the counseling center for people who want appointments or who have emergencies. We are located here on the Centennial campus on the first floor, just off of the rotunda. And at Rampart, we are tucked down a journey behind campus police. And we're there, I think 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and at Centennial campus, 5 days a week typically. So, yep, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or any observations. I feel like this can be really new things for people.
Yeah, I think one of the questions I have is, while the 5 skills I think are great when you're in like a calm state or like a middle state, how do you like get into the practice of when you're in the red state, like all the time or like frequently, or like in a very traumatic triggered area? How do you like get to calm yourself down? Because sometimes those really just don't work when you're triggered.
Yeah, Skylar, do you mind switching back to that big old chart slide? Thank you. So here, that when you're in the red zone, you're in shutdown mode, actually. And so I think that I had focused on choosing skills that were when people are in the sympathetic aroused mode. So like I'm thinking about, like anxiety, fear, panic, like shaking, getting really stressed out about like walking across the stage, or anxious about like getting a job. And so I didn't focus on the skills for when you're in shutdown collapse. But I think that that's a really important place. People it does happen. I go there more frequently actually than I go into panic fear personally. But because that is so the response is sort of like an opposite reaction thing, right? So if you are in that really activated like panic, fear, anger, fight, flight state, the thing that we want to do is try to down regulate you. But in that shutdown collapse state, part of what we need to do is mobilize you, is like let you know that you start moving to get to kind of, so you kind of approach it from that right side of the chart. So where you see all those bodily things. Actually, I should move my ones of you. So when it says things like temperature, depth of breath decreases, social behavior decreases, attunement to human voice, heart rate even. So those are the things that we could begin to make interventions on. So the actions to take when you're in that shutdown collapse space could be to do things to increase your heart rate. So that could be like more vigorous movement. So not just rhythmic movement, but something that is like really vigorous, try hard movement. Or like singing a really hard, fast song, like something that like really gets your heart moving. It doesn't have to be like your body in motion. Doing temperature change is a really big one. So that could be taking a cold shower. And I say cold shower, I know it says that your body temperature is decreasing. When you take a cold shower, your body's response reflex is to create heat inside you to keep you safe. So it's actually a way of raising your core body temperature. Social behavior, like just seeking people out, like watching their faces and trying to find a way to attune to how they are feeling and watching them attune to you, like that's a thing that can make people feel safe and kind of come down out of this collapse shutdown phase, if that makes sense. So I think that is a different kind of, I think I'm curious to hear, like you all are students and or are talking to students. Do you hear a lot of symptoms in the shutdown collapse phase when you're talking with students about stress?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of our students, when they're speaking to me at least, they have been building up in the sympathetic stage for quite a while. So if something like over the top happens, they're going over into the higher portion, which is why I was saying like the breathing and all of that is great. But when you've not dealt with the triggering responses over and over and over again. And something such as like commencement anxiety happens, for instance, that can just be the needle in the haystack that like throws you over. So in talking about that,
yeah. So I would say I'm going to stay with my initial arguments about like the physical things to do to address like what the body is doing, but a lot of that is like trying to get to the emotions via the body, because emotions are actually really hard to get to. At the Counseling Center, we mostly use cognitive behavioral therapy, and that is a way of using your thoughts, like your cognitions, to get at your emotions, again, because it's really hard to just be like, don't be sad, you know? So in our next group, next Thursday, we'll talk more about thoughts and kind of like exploring the thoughts that sometimes elicit these feelings. So like, what is eliciting your fear about the future, you know, or your hopelessness, and how do we make interventions there? But I think I think what you were saying is a really astute observation, that if people are living and their baseline stress level is actually already very high, it doesn't take a lot to push them up over the edge into that shutdown collapse phase. So trying to lower that floor of their sympathetic system, for me, is like a starting place, so that when we start to talk about thoughts around, for instance, like if someone is in extreme panic, we just try to de-escalate them. We're not like, tell me about your childhood. And that's a way of understanding that like when people are really escalated, they're not actually able to engage cognitively. So if we try to lower the floor first of that sympathetic system, then we can start to do that cognitive work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
I really appreciate your question, and I really look forward to talking about thoughts next week. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.